This week, Zixia and Palo Alto are on my nice list. As the Sage Communications news, to go IPO or not to go IPO, policy management in the cloud, of course, Juniper makes an acquisition, and shutting off FTP and Telnet, because they're always on my naughty list. All that and more on this edition of Enterprise Security Weekly. This is a Security Weekly production.
Brought to you by IT Pro TV is an easy, entertaining approach to online IT training. Access over 2,000 hours of up-to-date, high-quality video content live and on demand via your Chromecast, Roku, Amazon Fire TV, Apple TV, PC, mobile device, or their recently launched Apple TV app. Corporate and group pricing are available, and now through December 31st, if you purchase a premium annual membership, you'll get an additional 3 months on your first year. Visit itpro.tv/enterprise security and use the code ES30 for a free 7-day trial and 30% off for life. LogRhythm's Netmon Freemium delivers real-time network visibility to quickly identify emerging threats in your IT environment. Netmon Freemium is a free commercial-grade network forensics and traffic analytics solution. You can use Netmon Freemium's powerful capabilities to search against all of observed network traffic, identify abnormal traffic patterns and application usage, and quickly analyze full packet captures. Take the first step towards real-time network visibility. Visit logrhythm.com/freemium to learn more and download it today.
Welcome, everyone, to Enterprise Security Weekly. This is episode 25, and it's December 8th for 2016. I'm your host, Paul Asadorian, on this wonderful journey where we're going to tell you about the naughty and the nice security vendors in enterprise security. And we're, of course, broadcasting live from G-Unit Studios in Rhode Island. I'd like to introduce our special guest host for today, Don Pezet from ITPro.tv, who's been working in IT for over 18 years, training and hosting educational content for over 12 years. He's a certified trainer with many vendors, including Microsoft and Cisco. His combination of real-world experience, textbook knowledge, and a questionable sense of humor, I got one of those too, have helped him entertain and educate thousands of people. Don, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me, Paul.
Yes, and we have a quick announcement about IT Pro TV. You guys are always updating your course library, CompTIA, Security Plus, CEH, version 9, Red Hat Linux, computer hacking, forensics, investigator, and so much more. You guys are doing an awesome job.
Thank you. Yeah, security is a ever-changing topic. So for a company like us, we have to constantly update it, and we have a lot of fun with it. So it really is a great opportunity to do that. And there's just no limit. A good IT security person is always learning, is what we say, and that's what we do.
Excellent. We're jumping right into your interview. Here I am thinking, I'm all excited about the stories, but we have a topic to discuss, which is one that John and I touched on a little bit. We made some recommendations across the board for security professionals to find training specifically for the enterprise. But what I want to talk with you about today, Don, which I think is a problem that we have in the industry, is how to fill the IT security skills gap. And this kind of ties into the large demand that we see for IT security folks. My first question is, which security skills are lacking most in the enterprise today? And I'm sure in your position, you're probably paying close attention to this issue.
Yeah, it's one we've actually had kind of a challenge addressing, because the biggest lack, in my opinion, is practical skills. There's a ton of great certifications out there and great courses where people are learning fundamentals and theory. And don't get me wrong, fundamentals and theory are important. You got to understand that as a foundation to build off of. But if you're going to get out there in the real world and be successful, you need to know how to do things, how to actually have some practical skill to apply. And with the security world, things change so fast. They change every day. that you've really got to be passionate about it and get there and get involved and continue to learn things. So if you're not getting your feet wet with real applications, real skills, if you're not doing penetration tests and actually performing some of the exploits that you've learned about, you're really doing yourself a disservice. So we find people that have focused too much on fundamentals and theory and not turned it into something they can apply in their actual trade.
And this is hard for a lot of reasons. I liken it to my own experiences where I was interviewing for a position as a systems administrator with a focus in security. And they were asking me about my general Linux and Unix knowledge. And they asked, hey, have you ever used or set up NFS? And my response was, yeah, I have it running at my house. And they're like, what? Like, yeah, I've got an NFS server and share files. It's great. So what are your thoughts on that, on people setting up kind of their home labs to get experience?
Sure. There's a burden you have in the real world that you don't have in a lab. So we'll run with NFS as an example. So when you go and set that up, authentication with NFS is kind of a pain in the butt because
big time.
You have user ID mapping that has to happen and all those challenges. So now if I don't have some kind of centralized directory like a open LDAP deployment and I'm managing individual user accounts, I got to make sure their IDs match. Well, if I'm in a lab, I've got 2 computers, no big deal. I'll make those IDs match. Mm-hmm. But if I've got 100 servers and I'm trying to spread that access across all these systems, or I'm deploying in the cloud where I'm trying to real-time respond and deploy cloud servers to grow my auto scale a pool or whatever, that's really hard to keep track of and really hard to use at any great volume. So you've always got to think about that when you're working on something in your own personal lab or at home, is say, all right, I know how to do this for one person. Could I turn around and do it for 1,000 people? And what happens is people get out in the real world, they find out it's hard to do it for 1,000 people, and they cut corners. They say, you know what, screw it. I'll make an NFS share, and I'll just treat everybody as root, or I'll give everybody read-write access and hope for the best. I'll back it up.
That's interesting. I think that's why we run into a lot of the situations, because it's that chicken and egg problem. I don't have the experience in the real world until I go into the real world. My experiences before that might be in a lab where I didn't have to worry about scalability and uptime and some of these real world problems that we run into. Authentication and authorization being, I think, one of the most challenging, especially when you get into mixed environments of operating system and cloud versus on-premise. So, yeah, I definitely think that's an issue that needs to be addressed. And, finding... So the other example I had, Don, was one of our sponsors on one of our other shows makes SAP security software, and it's hard to find people with SAP security experience because trying to go, not many people are like, hey, I'm going to go set up SAP in my house. I set up NFS, and that was fun. But, setting up SAP, it wasn't on my radar. I mean, it should be as pen testers today, so maybe it's a bad example, but we don't always have access to the resources and software that are in use in enterprises as well, making it more challenging.
It certainly does, and that's one area where the cloud is really starting to help us a lot, is you're seeing more and more vendors where you go to their website and they'll have cloud-based labs that are, it used to be you'd see like a YouTube video or some dumb animation on the website. Our product's great, but now it's take it for a test drive, and you click a button and it takes you to a virtual environment and you can test drive it and run through it. You see vendors like SolarWinds, right? SolarWinds makes all sorts of network monitoring software, and it's expensive. They're proud of their software. It costs a lot of money. You might not be able to deploy it yourself, or you may just not have enough devices to monitor to see it. But you go to their site, they have an interactive demo. You can go through and run through the whole system. It's pretty cool to see that and get your feet wet. But people need to be thinking that way, is I've got to use some of the real tools. You mentioned authentication. Well, I know I can set up a Radius server and do centralized authentication, but when I go out in the real world, people aren't necessarily deploying Radius the way they used to. Now they're doing things like Cisco ACS or some of the IAM solutions from Amazon or other types of solutions.
Now you're bringing back memories of horror.
And so you got to say, all right, well, I understand Radius, which is this kind of textbook example of centralized authentication, but I need to understand some of the third-party software that people are actually using in the real world. It's hard to learn that. There's not certifications on it because it's not so popular.
Right.
But
it's hard. I mean, I've set up radius for smaller projects, and I was like, oh yeah, like cool, I understand. I even did that like on the job. I was like, oh, let's set up a radius server for this small like localized instance, and I get it, right? And then we went to implement, this was working for a university, and so I think the first radius server I set up was so that administrators on the network could authenticate to all of the network devices. So a very small set of users, a very limited use case, and then they said, well, Paul, you have experience with radius, and it's working great, and which it was probably working okay. I just gave the illusion that it was working great. And they're like, yeah, now we want to implement a radius server to handle authentication for the campus as a whole as part of the authentication to the wireless network. I was like, yeah, I could do that. And then I went to go set that up, and I was like, holy crap, is this different? Like, there's so many different things that I had to play with. I had to integrate at the central LDAP directory. I had to take authentication from these different things that were using radius, and they all did it in a slightly different manner. And it was 10 times harder than doing that. So.
And I've run into something similar doing like hardware tokens. If you've ever used RSA Secure ID tokens, they have the RSA security appliances that you can throw in, which at the end of the day you interact with as a radius server. And so it's technically radius, but behind it is a lot of extra RSA technology. And we used to use that so that when I would log into a router or switch, a firewall, I would have my username and password, and I'd have my token ID number that I had to punch in. So you have that level of security. So those skills aren't useless. They still come in, but they're being changed by these other vendors. So you've got to try and get experience with that. It's not realistic to say, I'm going to get trained in every security product that's out there, but you try and pick the big ones, the popular ones. You might hate Cisco, but they're what's out there. So we need to learn their products. Or you see Juniper and Palo Alto and the other guys. They're really Cisco's having to fight to stay on top. But to try and learn every one of their products is difficult. So when you go to work somewhere and you find out the products that are in place for your organization, you need to focus like a laser beam. You need to learn how to actually manage those particular products, and don't get distracted by the other things that are out there until you've mastered what you've already got. So many people just deploy technology after technology after technology, and they're not making full use of what they've got. There's so many great tools out there, but you got to master what's already in place.
Yeah, and I have similar experiences with Cisco equipment. I'd set some stuff up at my house, and that was one thing, but actually doing it in the real world is totally different, right? There's a lot more variables, and the repercussions are very different, right? Taking down a router in the university could have massive repercussions for tens and thousands of users, where at home, you can just mess around at will. So what's the recommendation? Is it, should people also be focused on not just training and certification in any way they can get it, but also what about internships and fellowships? Is that an avenue that you would recommend?
Well, normally I would. Security, it's tough. It's hard to go to a company and say, hey, I'm not looking for you to pay me, but will you let me come in and watch what all of your security guys do? And, and most of them, they're not going to let that fly. So it's very difficult to get that kind of experience that normally you have to come into the business, maybe not even as a security person, maybe as support desk or some kind of systems admin, and then you work with the security people and you move into that role, which would be for people starting out. If you're not starting out, you've already got field experience, you've already been out there, and the odds are you can come in and implement solutions. Just because a company has a particular software product doesn't mean it's the best, so maybe it needs to be replaced with something you're already familiar with. We don't want to pick software just because it's something we're already familiar with, though. We want to make sure we're picking software because it's the best, or the appliances that are the best for the need that we've got. A lot of companies have started outsourcing it and just saying, look, security is hard. So let me just push that off on somebody else. And, maybe we'll go with a cloud solution or software as a service where we don't worry about it at all. And if you go that route, how do you know the cloud provider is actually maintaining the level of security that you need? So now it's not just the security tools that you've got, but it's the compliance and auditing tools to make sure that things are actually being done the way they're reported. It's challenging to cover all those bases. So the approach I always take is, when I go to work somewhere, even if I'm not a security person, if I'm just a network admin, system admin, whatever, I start paying attention to all the systems I've got, and at a minimum, reading the hardening guides for them. Every vendor puts out hardening guides, looking at the tools that are available. I'm a voracious reader. I read everything that I can get. So reading the manuals and the information on those products, finding out what they can do and finding out how they solve that kind of security solution for the environment, and trying to locate areas that are missing and replace it. But that's all stuff that you don't learn in the classroom, where you're learning about the fundamentals of something. They can't teach you a specific product, and you've got to ramp up to that really, really fast.
So I don't know how frequently occurring this situation is, but here at Security Weekly, we actually had someone that was working for a university that did a fellowship with us. And so the university, and this person was working in either a department or in the central IT, I forget which, and said, hey, I applied for this, and I'd like to do my fellowship with you and learn some security stuff. And the university paid that person to come work for us for a while to acquire skills. And then there was probably some stipulation, I would imagine, that person has to stay at the university for a while after that. But that was a great way, I thought. And I don't, like I said, I don't know how frequently occurring it is that you have a job that will allow you to do a fellowship like that. But that's a really cost-effective way to get training. Even from the university's perspective, they still paid this person, but they didn't have to pay extra to get that person training. So that's a good scenario. Again, I don't know if you've seen that practice more often than I have done.
We've done it here in our company because we do training. It's what we like to see, but it is a challenging thing to find out there in the real world. I think, like for the Security Weekly viewers out there, if they were to go and ask 10 companies for that kind of a role, 9 of them wouldn't even return the call. But when you find one, a college or a university, they're focused on learning. Learning companies do that. Some kind of like auditing companies, they'll usually do that too, because they eventually need more people to go out and do those audits. So it's finding that balance, finding the right company, and you might have to search around, but there is no substitute for hands-on training, actually getting that exposure and experience on a large scale. It's just that's the information you need.
One of the biggest gaps that I see today in security, Don, is actually with Windows Active Directory. And I think that, don't get me wrong, there's a lot of very skilled people at Windows Active Directory. However, when I talk to people that do penetration tests, they will do, 75 clients or 100 clients in a year, and they say, like, maybe once a quarter, there's a really difficult one to get into, and largely that stems from they've got an Active Directory person that not only can set things up and make things run, but do that securely as well. And I think that's a real gap that we have in the skills today. And do you agree? And what resources do we have for folks?
Yeah, there's a double-edged sword when you deploy technologies with a graphical user interface, right? That's what I blame for all this, the GUI. If you have a GUI, you can hit next 15 times and you deploy that technology, and it works. So you might feel like you're done and you walk away. And in the meantime, there's a lot of steps you haven't taken to secure that properly. The Active Directory, they've designed that to be backwards compatible. Microsoft, because they're an enterprise company, they're pushing out software to businesses, they want to maintain that backwards compatibility. And as a result, they'll support old things. I mean, NT4 support just died a few years ago. And I don't mean the technical support side. I mean the actual protocol authentication side of it. And so that stuff, it hangs around a while. And if you know about it, if you go in there and you take the time to say, all right, well, let me change these policy settings, let me adjust these domain controllers, you can really tighten that down. And if people would just take the time to read the hardening guides that the vendors put out, and not just the vendors. So Microsoft, Cisco, Juniper, all those guys, they put out hardening guides on their hardware, on their software to help you properly secure it. But then there's other organizations like NIST and the NSA, and I know the NSA is not necessarily in everybody's good, not necessarily on the nice list, but they do put out some great guides that help you for securing your business to protect your systems and to make sure that they are secure. With the Active Directory, the biggest mistake I see people make is they assume that people outside of the network are bad and people inside of the network are good. And a lot of times people inside the network aren't necessarily good.
Well, and so the bad guys get on the inside of the network, and we talked about this last week, Don, which is why it's on the tip of my brain, is that once a pen tester or a bad guy gets in, they are primarily exploiting authentication, authorization, and trust between systems to essentially control the entire organization and gain access to everything and what we call completely own the organization, right? And we talked about all the technical things that can be done to prevent that, and a lot of it is what you're saying, right? There's backwards compatibility things that you have to go in and adjust settings, and there's a lot of technical details that even after we ran the segment, people are making me aware of how to protect systems from Mimikatz attacks and things like that. So.
Yeah, and enterprises, it's tough to be a business that, for example, you might have some document imaging software that only works in Internet Explorer 9 or 10. And so Internet Explorer 11 is out, or that Internet Explorer sucks and you want to switch to Chrome, but you can't because you've got this software that requires a particular version. It happens. And so you're kind of left with trying to make the best of that situation. What can I do to protect the system? And you can do intrusion detection devices or intrusion prevention devices. You can do firewalls and host-based IPS. You can do all sorts of stuff. But at the end of the day, the attackers are moving faster than those software and those appliances are. So we've got to try and make sure that we're selecting software intelligently, that it's from companies that are dedicated and focused on security. We need products where they design for security first and features second, not the other way around. Or a lot of times you see features first, price second, security third. So we got to make sure that the companies are in line with our own view. Otherwise, we end up being on that news report next Monday where they say such and such company leaks millions of customer records, and you don't want to be that person. You definitely don't want to be the one responsible for that. So that's the challenge we all face.
I think another area that certainly, in my estimation, lacks in some security skills is web application security. And I think there's two facets of this, right? There's the developers, and then there's the security folks as well. And I think the problem is kind of similar to IoT in some different areas where we say web application security, but there's dozens and dozens of different technologies, all which could have a different security model that you apply to it. And I think there's a skills gap there in learning how to properly secure various web application platforms.
When it comes to web applications, I used to work for a law firm, and the attorneys had this funny saying that they said, an attorney that represents themselves in court has a fool for a client. And I kind of look at that with web application security. If you're doing your own web application security, you're making a big mistake. That we kind of have blinders on when it comes to looking at our own applications. And our development team, the dev team who's been in there creating that software, they have blinders on too. They're going to take certain steps like field and input validation, which is essential, and other steps to prevent SQL injection attacks and the things they know about, and they're going to feel it's secure. But there's always other things that they just haven't thought of. And so you've really got to have a multi-pronged approach to it. You've got to have your own internal stuff that as you design the web applications, you're designing them securely, but that you're also using third-party independent auditors to scan and check that software. You need to do some red team, blue team kind of auditing on those web applications. They're so vulnerable. And that's the way that these attackers get in. And the terrible part is that a hacker can penetrate a web application and you don't even know it. And they can be sitting there for months on end. Just look at any of the United States government websites where they've been in there for months and months and months accessing data before somebody even notices. And it turns out that, on one web page there was a field and they weren't validating the input right and cleaning it or sanitizing it. And we end up with this compromise. We just didn't even know about it, but it was going on all that time. You've got to have auditors in there looking at that. It costs money, but it needs to be just part of the development budget that you've got to plan for that.
No, and I think it's a great point because even if, like for me as a security professional, if I focus on the security of a specific web application, in a large enterprise, there's likely other applications developed in different frameworks that I'm not going to get to. And that's where I always end up saying, well, if you do have knowledge of one, that's great, but you're going to have to, like you said, Don, go to third parties to get that validation of those other frameworks.
Yeah, and that's another thing that you can't really practice at home. I can't write an application and say, you know what, I'm going to hire some third party to come in and audit this application I just wrote in my off time. It's just too much money. But when you're out there in the real world, you get the chance to see that or get exposure to it. That's one of my goals for next year is that I want to film some content to actually show that process. Not like certification training, but just say like, here's here's how an external software audit or API audit goes, and what they check for, and what you do to react and correct, and all that. It's such a critical thing, but it goes back to the real world practical application of our skills. And it's not just learners that have that issue, but instructors, teachers, people like myself that have that issue too. We get in the habit of teaching these theories and not showing people something that can actually be done, and that's the big weakness that we have.
The last one, and this was especially the case when I was working for a vendor in the industry, there was a difficult time finding malware analysis and malware reverse engineers. And I'm not sure if it's because a lot of it ties into forensics, and there's like that line between forensics and security that's kind of blurry, but it's difficult to find people with those skills. And I'm pretty sure that's still the case today.
One of the challenges there is that a lot of companies don't like to disclose that they've had an incident. And so when they have a security incident, maybe they handle it completely properly, right? So that they follow all the necessary steps to make sure their customer data is secure and that everything's taken care of, but they don't want people talking about it. So the people that get real world experience dealing with that incident are then not allowed to talk about it. So they're not allowed to share that information and exchange it. There's some people that are, like the big Target exploit that happened a year or two ago. Mm-hmm. They have been really good about putting information out there, not all the information, but a good bit of the information of here's what happened, here's how they got in, here's what we've done to kind of stop it, here's what we could have done to prevent it. And so we all get to learn from their mistake. But even then, it's still missing some of those technical details that would really help us to get an idea of what's going on. We can still be vulnerable to some of the same things that happened to them, and they're not going to share that data because it starts to weaken their existing security, what's going on now. So that's a really challenging thing to get through. But if we can keep a handle on all the exploits that are going on out there, the ones that we hear about, if we can find real information about what happened, we can take the steps to prevent it. And you're seeing a lot of companies now that are pushing the intelligent threat detection systems where they have a security center somewhere, a lab, where they're paying attention to all the attacks going on the internet and communicating it to their software that runs in your deployment as fast as they can to block things. Even that is not usually fast enough in most cases. And there's so many different ones, and they're not sharing information. If people would just share more information, a lot of these problems would start to go away.
Oh, I agree. And I think, threat intelligence we've talked about on the show a lot. And it's interesting when we talk about malware reverse engineering. And it seems the people that have the skills are able to detect malware in their own environments and analyze it and make that process faster than trying to aggregate threat detection, threat intelligence feeds rather, and figure out how the malware is working and then somehow match that to other systems and behavior in their own network and systems. So I think that's a crucial skill, which is interesting to see how that progresses. So Don, you're going to stick around and be the guest host for this episode in the absence of John Strand, and Don is going to help me go through the enterprise security news for this week. So, Don, thank you very much for your insights on training and bridging the skills gap. And we're going to take a short break and come right back.